Howdy folks, hope you're all enjoying your weekends, and welcome to, I think this is now the third iteration of the Submarine Test in World of Warships. This test got sprung on us with about 10 minutes notice. Not quite sure what the rush is, but, well, here it is. And there have been some fairly substantial changes this time around. Some of them I quite like, a lot of them I kind of don't. I'm not really sure which side of the fence I sit on this time around. I think the one thing that I can definitely say without much fear of being contradicted is that if you are any kind of aficionado of historical submarine or anti-submarine warfare, you're probably not going to like a lot of what is happening in this third test. I should stress, of course, that it is just a test. We're still very much in the proof of concept phase, and there isn't anything that you see here that can't be changed. And there's quite a bit that you're going to see here that I sincerely hope does get changed. Although there are some things that I definitely think are good additions. But there are also changes in this third version of the test that don't really make an awful lot of sense. And the justifications given for them make even less sense. And then there are things that I had fervently hoped would be addressed in this third version of the submarine test, which haven't actually been addressed yet, and in fact, thanks to some of the other mind-boggling changes that they've made, are now in fact even worse. What sort of things are we talking about? Good question. Glad you asked. First, let's take a look at the submarines that are available. As well as the U-69 and the USS Cachalot, there is now apparently a third submarine which you can unlock by completing the Dive, Dive, Dive combat mission. The only problem with that is that there is no Dive, Dive, Dive combat mission, or if there is, it's extremely well hidden. So if there is a third submarine available on this third version of the test, well, you're not going to be seeing it in today's video, that's for sure. Sorry. Address your complaints to Wargaming. As for the existing two submarines, the USS Cachalot and the U-69, once again there just doesn't really seem to be any point whatsoever in picking the U-69. Once again, I do understand that the individual stats of the submarines available aren't the focus of this test, it's still just a proof of concept, but I just don't understand why the Cachalot is better than the U-69 in almost every way that matters. The Cachalot has around about 20% more hit points, it has one more torpedo tube than the U-69, and the torpedoes that it fires travel 4 kilometers further, at 3 knots faster, and do 3,000 more damage. The only advantage the U-69 has is a faster torpedo reload. Now, while both submarines have the same maximum speed of 23.6 knots, the U-69 has double the turning radius and almost double the rudder shift. The only real place where the U-69 has a clear advantage is in concealment. She has a surface detectability range of 4 kilometers compared to the Cachalot's 5, but, well, 5 still beats any destroyer that either of these submarines are going to have to fight, so it's not really that much of an advantage. And it's here where I noticed something weird. Take a closer look at some of the numbers there in the concealment values, and this is exactly the same on the Cachalot, it's not just the U-69. Assured detectability range 2 kilometers, and underneath that, detectability at periscope depth 1 kilometer. It's not just me, is it? Detectability at periscope depth 1 kilometer. When is 1 kilometer ever going to be a thing? If your assured detectability under all possible circumstances is 2 kilometers. I'm not the only one who sees the glaring lack of logic there, am I? You know, I don't expect everything to be perfect on a test server, far from it. I understand that mistakes are going to be made and a lot of things are probably going to be placeholders. Yet I can't help but feel, and it's not just this, but things like this, a sort of general sense of not really being ready, of not really being finished. Yes, I realise that sounds like a strange complaint to have of something that's on a test server, but it kind of feels like that. And when you take that into account with things like the fact that even after the test is up, there's still no mention of it on the Wargaming Game Center, and no mention of it at all on the World of Warships web portal, I can't help but feel, wise and old cynic though I may be, But I can't help but feel that perhaps this third iteration of the submarine test has been pushed out, not quite with all the rough edges polished off it, and definitely with zero notice whatsoever, perhaps, maybe, in order to draw attention away from something else? Or maybe I'm just reading far too much into all of this. I mean, we as community contributors were aware that there was going to be a third submarine test soon. We just didn't realise that soon meant as soon as we'd finished our coffee. But whatever the reason, the test is up, so let's take a look at what's new. And let's start by focusing on what I at least consider to be the good things. For a start, light cruisers now have access to the depth charge consumable. It's no longer just destroyers. I'd love to be able to give you an example of a light cruiser conducting a depth charge attack on a submarine, but because nobody told anybody that the test was going up, after spending 5 minutes in queue waiting for a battle, I got into a game with precisely one player on the enemy team, and he wasn't in a submarine. So, well, I can at least show you the depth charge icon. So there you go, the USS Dallas now has depth charges. I can't actually show you myself using the depth charges on the USS Dallas because there were apparently only 4 people aware that the server was up in the first place, and 2 of those were in another battle, so yeah. Still, the fact that light cruisers now also have access to depth charges is, at least in my opinion, a very good thing. Another good thing is that you're able to fire your torpedoes while submerged, and I don't just mean at periscope depth, at any depth. And what that means is that submarines now have the ability to fight each other while submerged. It's certainly not easy. Could probably use a little bit of work, but, well, that's why the test server exists. Because you're operating in a 3D environment, you are almost certainly never going to score a torpedo hit on another submerged submarine unless you've first got yourself a sonar ping lock onto them. The problem here is kind of related to another new thing. The oxygen meter is gone. It's been replaced by a battery level indicator, and you drain your battery while you're underwater and you recharge it when you're at periscope depth. And your sonar pings eat into your battery supply. Right now I don't have enough battery power to actually get a torpedo lock on the submarine that I know is in front of me. So the concept is sound, and I genuinely believe that giving submarines the ability to engage each other underwater is a solid gameplay step, even if historically it's almost complete nonsense. And I think all it really needs to make it a potentially very exciting gameplay dynamic is just a little bit of polishing and fine-tuning of the details. Submarines also have a new hydrophone mechanic, and this is to address the issue of submarines while submerged basically not having the faintest idea of what's going on around them, unless they're within the assured detectability range of a bunch of enemy ships, which is not someplace you really want to be when you're in a submarine, particularly if those ships are armed with depth charges. The idea is, and this is actually quite historically accurate, that there's somebody on board your submarine hunched over the hydrophones and listening out for the engine noises generated by enemy ships. And when he hears something, it looks like this. But he'll only hear something if that target is making enough noise, and that roughly translates into moving fast enough. So if you're stopped, and I don't actually know what the limits are here, but I'd imagine if you're moving at quarter throttle, you're probably not going to generate enough noise to be picked up by a submarine's hydrophone. So this hydrophone, I think, is a very useful new feature, another step in the right direction. And I'm also very, very happy to be able to report that submarines retain, from the first 2 iterations of the test, the ability to ram each other while submerged as well. I admit I have absolutely no idea why my submarine survived that collision, and Flamu's submarine did not, but I'll take it. And if nothing else, it once again proves, as if there was any doubt, that youth and beauty will forever be trumped by old age and treachery. So, having now exhausted the list of positive things in the third submarine test, let's move on to everything else. Starting with the submarine's inability to travel on the surface. And Wargaming said they were removing this because nobody gained any benefit from it. Well, I don't exactly agree with that statement, but let's just take it as read for the moment and address it directly. You see, here's the thing. If your design confers no benefit upon a submarine for being on the surface, that's a problem with your design, because there are actually all kinds of benefits for submarines being on the surface, and one of those at least was in your design. They could see further. They should also be able to move a lot faster. But instead we've got this ludicrous situation where a submarine sees further when it's at periscope depth, which shouldn't be the case, and moves faster when it's fully submerged, which shouldn't be the case. All because they apparently don't gain anything from being on the surface. Well, I can think of two things right off the top of my head. Visibility and speed. They're using these two problems that they have created to justify taking away a feature that nobody asked them to take away in the first place. And in any case, it's not just all about the submarines here, you know. There's an issue for destroyers, cruisers and battleships that I pointed out and complained about in both previous iterations of the submarine test that not only hasn't been addressed in the third iteration, but by removing the ability to target submarines on the surface, they've actually made it worse. Because if you're in a cruiser, a destroyer or a battleship, the only way that you can realistically expect to be able to hit a submarine with your guns was when it was on the surface. When they were submerged, even at periscope depth, which is now the closest to the surface you're ever going to find them, they're all but impossible to hit. Let's say, like this Fuso, you have armour-piercing shells loaded, and a submarine is spotted 5.4 kilometres away. Where do you aim to hit him? Because it's not at the surface. And if the answer to that question is, how the fuck am I supposed to know? Well, congratulations, you're in excellent company. Actually, it's a trick question. You can't do any damage to him with armour-piercing shells. You have to score a direct hit to do damage with armour-piercing shells, and you can only do that when he's on the surface. When he's below the water, the shells are going to arm on impact with the water. So, yeah. Well, what about high explosive? That works for battleships, but it doesn't work for cruisers, and it doesn't work for destroyers, because once again, the shells are going to detonate on impact with the water. And while battleship, large caliber high explosive shells are probably going to have sufficient blast radius to damage a submarine at periscope depth or possibly slightly below, cruisers and destroyers? Nope. So now there are no submarines on the surface that can actually be attacked by everybody else, and when they're at periscope depth, only battleships who happen to have high explosive loaded and are lucky enough to have their guns pointing in the right direction stand a chance of doing any damage to them. But they don't even have to come up to periscope depth anymore. Previously, with the oxygen mechanic, when you ran out of oxygen, you were forced to emergency surface. And then, anyone who wasn't in a destroyer close enough to attack you with depth charges actually had a chance of doing some damage to a submarine. But, well, that doesn't happen anymore, because now they can't surface. And when they're at periscope depth, which is as close as they're now going to get to the surface, the only things that can reliably do any damage to them are battleships who happen to have high explosive loaded and happen to have their guns pointing in the right direction, or aircraft carriers who happen to have a squadron of dive bombers with high explosive bombs overhead at that exact moment. And the best part is that submarines don't even need to come to periscope depth anymore. They're much slower at periscope depth, and the only benefit that they actually gain is increased visibility and the ability to recharge their batteries. Now, admittedly, they need battery power to ping you and get a torpedo lock-on, but they can still fire their torpedoes when they're fully submerged, and if they have sufficient battery power, they can still get a torpedo lock-on via a sonar ping when they're submerged. So what all of this means is that battleships are now completely at the mercy of submarines. And in case you think I'm exaggerating just to make a point, then, well, allow me to prove that I'm not. Submarines now have two different types of sonar ping available to them. You select your sonar by pressing the 1 key, and then you actually ping the sonar by hitting the fire button, usually the left mouse button. You now have to choose between either a wide spread and slow sonar ping, or a narrow spread and fast sonar ping. Now, I don't know why sound is suddenly travelling through water at different speeds all of a sudden. Like I said, Historical accuracy, physics and realism got thrown out of the window with this test. How much of a deal breaker this is likely to be for you is going to depend entirely on how much you value gameplay over realism. I mean, this is an arcade game. It's not a simulator. We're playing a game where radar can see through islands already. It's a gameplay mechanic, fine. I don't have to like it, but I do get it. Once you have a ship targeted, and this is nothing new, 2 sonar target points, I suppose you'd call them, appear on the ship. And if you can ping either of these target points with your sonar, you're going to get some benefits. The first of which, with 1 target lock, is that your torpedoes now become homing torpedoes. If you manage to get and maintain 2 target locks, however, because these pings don't stay locked on forever, then as well as being homing torpedoes, they now also completely 100% bypass any torpedo damage reduction that target may have. And what class of ship has the most torpedo damage reduction, because they're also the biggest and easiest targets to hit with torpedoes in the first place? Oh yes, those battleships. Now, in previous versions of the test, providing you weren't asleep at the wheel and you were at least paying some kind of attention to what was going on around you, even if you were in a battleship, it wasn't impossible to avoid the homing torpedoes. You shouldn't expect to be able to avoid them all the time, but it was certainly possible to avoid them some or even most of the time. And if you were in a cruiser or destroyer, you really had to be asleep at the wheel in order to take a hit from one of these homing torpedoes. Let's just say that's no longer the case. These homing torpedoes are just absurd. I'm not even afraid of destroyers anymore. It's as if they've taken World War II submarines and given them Mark 48 ad caps. French destroyer over there. I'm not even at periscope depth, I'm fully submerged. So he has a rough idea that there's a submarine over here, but I can see him, I can target him, I can fire torpedoes at him, and even while submerged, I can maintain a sonar ping lock on him. And as you can see by the torpedoes whizzing harmlessly over my head, nobody can hit me with a torpedo unless they're also in a submarine within 2 kilometers and manage to get a sonar lock onto me as well. And while it's definitely more difficult than when you're at periscope depth to get and maintain a sonar lock on a target, it's definitely not impossible. It's not like I've had a lot of practice at this. The test's only been up an hour, but this is easy enough, and the homing torpedoes are good enough that, well, even destroyers are easy kills. And if destroyers are easy kills, what chance does a battleship stand? Admittedly, a lot of this is nothing new. I mean, in previous versions of the test, if you were able to get a double sonar ping lock onto a target, not only did your torpedoes home in on them, but they also lost all of their torpedo damage reduction. What's different this time around is just how manoeuvrable these torpedoes are all of a sudden. The most extreme example of which I witnessed while watching Flamu streaming from the test server just a couple of hours ago.
Shit, I'm still fusing fast ping. I thought I switched, but I didn't. They did turn for him, though. Look at this fucking... What the shit? That's so broken!
Yeah, I know what he means. That was a Gnevny. That wasn't a slow destroyer. I should probably point out and remind everybody that, you know, before we all start grabbing our pitchforks and burning torches, that at least as far as these hyper-manoeuvrable torpedoes are concerned, nothing that you've seen here can't be dialed back and adjusted just by tweaking a couple of numbers within the almighty spreadsheet. But as far as everything else is concerned, I can't help but feel that they're coming up with a solution to a problem that nobody was complaining about, and fixing it with a solution that nobody asked for. Was anybody really complaining that submarines weren't doing enough damage? Was anybody complaining that submarines were too easy to kill? In fact, the only thing that I was regularly and consistently complaining about in the previous 2 tests was that submarines, if you had no destroyers left, they were next to impossible to kill. Oh, that'll never happen, Jingles. Destroyers always survive until the end of battles. They never throw their lives away pointlessly by rushing into caps that are dominated by aircraft and radar cruisers in the first 2 minutes of a match. Are you fucking new here? And okay, they have partially addressed that issue by giving depth charges to light cruisers, and by making it possible for submarines to fight each other, even when they're submerged. But that's not a whole lot of consolation to anybody who isn't in a submarine, or isn't in a destroyer or light cruiser that's close enough to a submarine to be able to attack them with depth charges, and whose only option is to shoot at the bloody things, because now they've made it even harder, when they needed to make it easier. It's still no easier to accurately hit a submarine at... well, it's impossible to hit a submarine at periscope depth with your guns if you're in a cruiser or a destroyer. It's only possible if you're in an aircraft carrier or a battleship. And it's now completely impossible to hit them when they're on the surface, regardless of what ship you're in, because now they don't surface. It's a solution that nobody wanted to a problem that nobody was complaining about. I guarantee if you were to do a search through all of the forums, through Reddit, all of the feedback gathered and submitted through the previous 2 iterations of the submarine test, you will not find a single instance of people complaining that submarines were spending too much time on the surface. Oh, here's a problem that doesn't exist. Don't worry, we'll fix it. I can only hope and fervently pray that all that we're really seeing here in this 3rd iteration of the test is Wargaming turning the dial all the way up to 11 in the other direction, just to shake things around and see what falls loose. There are definitely some things in this latest version that I like. Light cruisers getting depth charges. I like that submarines are now able to fight each other underwater. I'm not even completely opposed to the idea of removing the oxygen supply and replacing it with a battery charge. If you want the submarines to be able to replenish their battery while they're at periscope depth, this was absolutely a thing. Submarines used snorkels to be able to run their diesel engines and recharge their batteries when they were at periscope depth. But there was a downside, there was a trade-off to it, because snorkels are bloody loud, and they could be heard from miles away. But if you put this into the game, rather than taking things out of the game, you introduce elements of risk management for submarine captains. You can travel while submerged. You can travel submerged, but you'll be slower, and you'll drain your battery. You can travel at periscope depth, where you'll be a little faster, but you'll make a lot of noise if you're using your snorkel. Or you can travel on the surface, where you'll be a lot faster, and you'll be able to recharge your battery, but at the expense of increased visibility. Instead, we've got this arse-about-tit situation where you can't travel on the surface at all, and when you're submerged, which should be where you're both blind and at your slowest, is in fact where you're at your fastest, and you're still perfectly capable of engaging and sinking even the fastest and most difficult to hit of surface vessels. Yeah, I'm really not feeling it. I mean, your mileage may vary, of course. I guess it all depends on just, you know, how much you like to have your games at least grounded in some semblance of reality. But I'm going to give a pretty hard pass on this 3rd version of the submarine test, and I'll look forward to see what happens in version 4. That's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found something interesting to talk about. I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.